Amid Scotland's ongoing cost of living crisis, poverty is blighting the lives of increasing numbers of people. Today, Humza Yousaf brought together a range of interested parties for an event he hoped would produce fresh ideas about what more can be done to reduce inequalities. After the meeting, the First Minister spoke to STV's political correspondent, Ewan Petrie.
First Minister, what are you hoping this anti-poverty summit achieves, and how do you measure the success of it?
So the success ultimately will be measured by whether or not we substantially reduce and actually shift the dial on poverty and child poverty in particular. Now, there's a lot of external factors, the UK government's recent mini-budget, for example, that has made reducing poverty really difficult. But I'm focused on what powers we do have and how do we use them to the maximum effect. And we've had a great challenge, actually, from the anti-poverty campaigners to say, what more can you do with the powers that you've got? So let's look at taxation, let's look at targeting our funding and our investment, and let's look at those tough choices that have to be made, as I say, to substantially shift the dial to tackle poverty.
Your predecessor also prioritised tackling poverty as well when Nicola Sturgeon came to power, but the rates of child poverty have barely budged since 2007 when the SNP came into power.
Well, let's remember from 2007 we have had, of course, over a decade of austerity from the UK government. We've had a hard Brexit imposed upon Scotland, which has caused wreaked economic havoc. We've, of course, had a global pandemic, as well as the fact that just in the last year, a mini budget which wiped over £70 billion from the UK economy. So these are external factors that we have no control over, that have seriously impacted our ability to reduce child poverty. But I don't doubt we can go further with the powers we have. But some of that will mean really tough decisions and really open and honest conversations about the action we take next.
Tax, tough decisions and targeting. What can people expect then when it comes to tough decisions on tax? Are we looking at increasing income tax?
So first and foremost, what they can expect is that everything we do will be evidence-based, and that's the work we're doing at the moment. I've been appointed as First Minister over the last 6 odd weeks, and what I've said to every single Cabinet Secretary is go back and look at our future policy development and what we've committed to, and let's make sure we have the evidence base that tells us this is where the money has to go in order to help us to reduce poverty and child poverty in particular, because I've made that a defining mission of mine, a defining mission of the government. In terms of taxation, I've made no bones about it, that I believe in progressive taxation. So again, let's do the evidence in relation to that for the next year's budget. And let's just make sure every pound and penny we spend is going to those that need it the most.
When you talk about targeting then, does that include the rollout of free school meals for all young people? Is that a commitment you will keep to?
Yeah, look, it's a manifesto commitment that I stood on and was elected on in 2021. So the plan is to continue that rollout to P6 and P7 as we committed to do in the manifesto. But I hope people would understand that, given especially the havoc that was wreaked by the UK government's mini-budget, it's right for us to look at every single policy we have and ask ourselves the question, does the evidence tell us that we could be more targeted so that those that need the support get it first? And I think that's an important exercise for us to do.
How would you square that with tackling rates of child poverty if you were to roll back on that commitment?
So again, I'm not saying we're rolling back on that commitment, but what I'm saying to you is that we should
very clear message by committing to it today.
Yes, and I said that that's the manifesto we stood on. But of course, targeting allows us to ensure that every penny on any policy is targeted towards those low-income households, those children that are in poverty. I'm in a blessed position. You know, I by any standard measure, with a First Minister's salary, I'm wealthy. Therefore, there is a question that people should rightly ask me that when it comes to certain benefits, should you be in receipt of them? Now, in certain cases, I believe in universalism, absolutely. Free education, for example, in university, access to free healthcare. These are universal benefits without any question. There are other measures we should look at to see whether or not we need to be more targeted.
So is the First Minister on the right track in the battle against poverty? We spoke with two people who were also at the summit, David Reilly from the Poverty Alliance and the community activist Terry McTernan. So you were both at the summit today and the First Minister spoke. What did you make of what he said, David?
So it was really welcome that the First Minister called the summit today. We think it was a good thing that there were so many organisations and people there from across Scotland. The First Minister spoke at the start and he was quite clear that what he wanted to do was be there to listen to the expertise of people that was in the room. And it was a good thing that there were so many people in the room who were experts in their own experience of poverty. So there was people in the room from across Scotland, who are living in poverty now, who'd grown up in poverty, and who are able to add that to the discussions of other types of experts like academics, people in unions and in business.
What did you make of what he said, Terry? And the fact that he said he was listening, does that suggest that they weren't before?
Well, I think it's fair to say he's only just been appointed First Minister, so I need to give him the benefit of the doubt, really. What I found really refreshing about the whole thing, though, was that poverty has finally managed to make its way up the priority list in the way that, in my mind, it should be. Poverty is not something that happened only last week. It's been entrenched in many of our communities for certainly all my life. Certainly the community that I come from, 6 decades of entrenched poverty. So for it now eventually to be at the top of the priority list, I'm very grateful for that in comparison to some of the other kind of more non-relevant points, climate change, things like that have their place, absolutely, but certainly we've taken our eye off the ball in terms of poverty increasing over recent years.
Well, tell us a bit about what life is like in Ferguson. It's one of the most deprived areas in Scotland.
Well, it's regularly labelled as such. This is very true. The SIMD figures and stuff often don't take into account the positives that also exist in Ferguson. So during the pandemic, for example, a number of very effective and wider-reaching poverty tackling initiatives were launched, including the community market, which follows very much similar to a pantry model, a seniors lunch club, which runs 3 times per week, all voluntary run, all locally led, and all identified during the most horrendous backdrop, the recent pandemic. So again, it raises real questions about us perhaps having to start looking at poverty through a different lens and approaching it from a different angle.
David, will this summit result in any meaningful action, or do you think it's politicians just wanting to be seen to be doing something?
I think it absolutely has to, and I think what's really important is that all politicians have a shared responsibility and a shared duty to come together to take actions that matter to people in communities. I think it's really important to be clear that poverty isn't inevitable. It's not a natural state of things. It's about political choices. And I think that there's lots of causes of poverty that we can take action on. Terry's talking about climate change. We know that the climate crisis is fueling the rise in food costs just now, which are hitting people who are poorest hardest. We know the rise in fuel and heating costs are felt by people who are living in the worst quality housing. So there's steps that government can take, the Scottish Government can take, about retrofitting housing to lower fuel costs, and that also lowers our carbon emissions, because we know that people in communities like in Ferguson Park, where Terry's from, they've contributed least to the climate crisis in Scotland, but they're at most at risk of the consequences of it.
I mean, what political decisions do you think the Scottish Government should be taking?
I think we've made some real significant strides over recent years. Increases in child payment, for example, described as what was that, a game changer, I think was the phrase that was kicking around. So on the ground, I'm seeing that is having a positive impact. But I think there's still some significant distance to travel. There is systemic change. Absolutely, systemic change is fundamental. But I think we do need to reflect on some of the really important lessons that were learned through the pandemic in terms of community empowerment, allowing communities to identify their own solutions. What necessarily will solve the problems in Ferguson might not solve the problems in another community. And I suppose the angle that I come at it from is that many communities could learn a lesson or two from the frugality of the people of Ferguson Park and just how far they can make a pound go. And that's really important in these times, certainly as we see poverty increasing almost by the day.
Is it your sense, David, that the cost of living crisis has increased poverty in Scotland?
Sadly, yes. I think that's absolutely the message from Poverty Alliance members from across Scotland, in rural Scotland and in urban areas, that there's people in Scotland who are in desperate situations just now, and that especially desperate because it is entirely unjust that there's people living with poverty in Scotland, that there's people living in hunger in such a wealthy country. And we are such a wealthy country. There is no shortage of food in this country. There's a shortage of money being spread equally. And that's absolutely been driven by cost of living crisis. We've seen an explosion in the cost of food. We've seen an explosion in the cost of heating bills. Incomes haven't kept up with that. So we need work that pays a real living wage so that people can afford to live in dignity. We need a social security system that protects us when we need it, and it protects people who are particularly at risk of poverty. disabled people, women with caring responsibilities, people from black and minority ethnic communities, and all of us who are at risk of poverty when it occurs.
I mean, are you seeing that as well? Are you seeing people's situations getting worse over the last few years because of the crisis?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it takes many forms. Just at a local level, we're seeing, for example, people who have in times gone by, certainly throughout the pandemic period, who are volunteering almost on a full-time basis simply because they had more time, they were in receipt of furlough and stuff like that, so they had that, are now having to take on second jobs, extra shifts at work just to keep the lights on. So that profoundly impacts some of the kind of poverty tackling initiatives that we run on the ground, because people simply aren't available or don't have that time to commit anymore. So it's tearing at the fabric of some of the resilience measures that we've managed to successfully build within our communities, and I suppose that's my main contribution this morning at the summit was, let's learn the lessons from that. Let's learn about the wide-reaching nature of some of the solutions that we very quickly and very identified and rolled out, and how can we build them into almost the everyday machinations of our communities.
But as Terry says, it's a deep-rooted problem. I mean, decades long in places like Fergus. Like, you know, there's no quick solutions. There's no quick fix to this.
Well, there's no silver bullet, but there's approaches that we know work. And we know that in Scotland we invest £3 billion a year in tackling poverty. We need to, as Terry says, we need to work that money as hard as we can. And one of the ways that we can do that is that when we're making decisions, we do it with communities, with people in communities, not to them. We know that if we're designing policies and designing interventions, they're more likely to work if they're done with people. That was one of the things that was really good about the summit today, that there was people with the experience of poverty there throughout, contributing as equals. We know that can make a real difference to policies. For example, Scottish Government has really welcomed and invested in public transport and trains, but it's buses that are needed to address poverty in communities.
So we heard some real authentic voices at the summit this morning. We will have to leave it there, but thank you both very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.